Does anybody remember what happened in our lesson last week?
Absalom got killed.
Okay, that's right. At the very end of the chapter 18, Absalom is killed. How does David take that?
He was upset.
Yeah, very upset, right? What's one of the reasons we just said last week that we think that David was so upset with Absalom's death? Guilt. Why did he feel guilty? What are some things that he should have felt guilty for?
He wasn't in his life very much, it didn't seem like.
Yeah, he kind of ostracized Absalom there for a while. What else?
He felt like his death was his fault.
Yeah, he thought that it had come about because of sins that took place himself. Maybe his own sexual sins with Bathsheba. Maybe the sin in not executing justice with his son. Which son am I talking about in executing justice? Amnon, right? And since he didn't execute the justice, who did that lead that justice to? Absalom, right? And when Absalom seeks that justice, according to the Mosaic law, a right that he had, he has to go into exile to his grandfather up in Geshur, and then we just kind of see the relationship start to unfold from there. And so David has to flee his capital city. Which city is that? Jerusalem, right? And so Absalom goes. He takes the capital city of Jerusalem, the city of David, the very city that David had liberated from the Jebusites. And so it literally was the city of David. And they fight, and David finds out that his son has been killed, and he weeps. And that's where we find ourselves tonight in chapter 19. And chapter 19 opens up with David still weeping because he just found out that Absalom has been killed. So chapter 19 kind of happens right in the middle of the story that we're told with David. So just keep in mind that David is weeping for his son Absalom, and you'll see what takes place here in these verses. Let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 8 together. It was told Joab, "Behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people, for the people heard that day, "The king is grieving for his son." And the people stole into the city that day as people steal who are ashamed when they flee in battle. And the king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, "O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son." And then Joab came to the house of the king and said, "You have today covered with shame the faces of your servants, who have this day saved your life and the lives of your sons and your daughters and the lives of your wives and your concubines, because you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. For you have made it clear today that the commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased. Now therefore arise, go out and speak kindly to your servants, for I swear by the Lord, if you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night. And this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now." And then the king arose and took his seat at the gate. And the people were all told, "Behold, the king is sitting in the gate." And all the people came before the king. And so, who is Joab? All right, Joab is the one who killed Absalom, right? What occupation or position does Joab have? All right, he's the commander of the army. Does he have any physical relationship to David? It's his nephew. And so Joab is his nephew, he's his general, and he's also the man that killed Absalom. And so Joab is a little brash, right? What was the first incidents we talked about Joab kind of being brash and killing someone without David's approval? Not Saul. Abner, right? Brownie points, Abner. And so now he does it again. Who does he kill this time? Absalom. Okay, so do you think Joab's kind of a rogue type of guy? I mean, he's a fantastic military general, but he's not afraid to do something the king doesn't agree with. And so what does Joab do today, or tonight in our story?
He grabbed a man by the beard and stabbed him.
Oh, you've read ahead. That's coming up, which is good.
It's interesting that he's mourning and so sad in this one, but when his son died in the other instance, after his son died, he got immediately over it and got back up and went about his business and said, "Well, my son's dead now, there's nothing I can do about it." I think it's different that both of them's David, both of them his son died, but completely different responses.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I haven't thought about that, Caleb, but that's fascinating. Chapter 12, right? The young son dies, the son of Bathsheba, the first son. The next one will be Solomon, who will become king. But yeah, he mourns the whole time he's sick. And after he dies, he washes himself and he says, you know what, he can't come back to me. And so here we see the exact opposite. That's interesting. Why do you think that is, Caleb?
I guess it's probably the terms of it all and the guilt. Well, the guilt would be both of them. I don't know.
Yeah, you would think the guilt would be just as intense in chapter 12 as it is here. It's fascinating. I don't know why. Maybe David's older, more sentimental. I don't know.
Because the difference when someone has a long extended illnesses, you actually mourn before they die.
Yeah.
Then when they die, you've already mourned some. Whereas when someone dies suddenly, you have to mourn afterwards.
Yeah. It's almost like in situations where, like you were saying, when you know a terminal illness has set on, it gives the family time to kind of collect their thoughts, their wits, time for plans and preparations. Still painful, no doubt, nonetheless. But the grieving process already begins, and closure comes maybe a little bit sooner. Whereas in the case of this being sudden, I mean, David tells all the commanders, right? David is not expecting Absalom to die in battle. Why does he expect that? Yeah, he told every single commander. The commanders over 50, the commanders over 100. He told all of them. He told the sergeants, the captains, the lieutenant generals, the major generals. He told them all, like, don't kill Absalom. Don't touch Absalom. And his 5-star general, the one who's in charge of everybody, what does he do? He throws 3 spears through him. I mean, so do you think there's some problem with leadership there in the palace?
You know, the 3 spears don't kill it.
Yeah.
The servants have to finish him off.
Yeah.
Joab was a warrior beyond my comprehension. I mean, he killed and he killed and didn't bother.
Yeah. It's yeah. Well, he was super good looking, so he was probably, very stout, very GQ Man of the Year and all that good stuff. Just moving on. That's a political comment. I'm not going to elaborate. Anyways, yes, Brother Rick.
Question. When he told the soldiers to be gentle, he said, gentle for my sake.
Yeah.
Why did he say for my sake as opposed to Absalom's sake?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like what we've been talking about, and I think what you're insinuating, like almost as a father, have you ever been in a situation where you had to whip your child and it hurt you more than it hurt them? I think it was this situation. He knew that
Takes him around the bed first.
he had to catch him first. Tried to wear you out before you got a hold of him. So I think David's telling them that, for my sake, be gentle with him. And Joab just doesn't care. Joab just sees this as his cousin who's ingrate, who has started a rebellion against the king, and he's there to finish it off. And so David mourns, and Joab's had enough of it. I mean, Joab's like, we just fought a war for you, and you came home crying with your tail between your legs like you just lost. Like, who are we? We fled the city with you. We were out in the wilderness with you. We didn't have any food with you. And we fought your battles and put you back on the throne, and you're over here going to cry like a little baby. Like, I mean, if you don't suck it up, we're leaving. Because this isn't going to be the king we're going to serve. And so what does David do? Yeah, he sucks it up, right? He goes out to the city gate. He sits on the chair out there, and he lets the people know, I'm back. And so Joab rebukes David and tells him, we're not doing this anymore. Sometimes we need that, don't we? David was going overboard with his grief. He was a king. This was someone, even though it was a son, that started a rebellion against him. And you can't start a civil war against the Lord's anointed without dying. That's just the way it is. And so every once in a while, we need friends like that too. Somebody to pull us aside and say, look, I love you, but you're being ridiculous, right? For most of us, we have a spouse, right? No, that was a joke. No, too close to home. Okay, all right. But we need friends like that, right? We need somebody to pull us aside and say, "Look, you're being a little overkill. Have a Snickers bar." And so that's what we need to do. And so we see here that the tribes accept David. This is a big deal because a lot of the men of the countryside went with Absalom. And so you've got all these people who've been fighting against David. Yes, Absalom is dead, but these are soldiers who thought enough of Absalom and so little of David to gather up arms and to have a war. And so David being accepted by his people is a really big deal. And so we see in verses 9 through 14 that those tribes do realize that David is the king. He is anointed by God, and we're sorry, you're going to be our king. And so then you see David forgives Shema. Who is Shema? That's right. You remember last chapter, right, as David is fleeing the city, there's a guy who's calling him a whole bunch of bad names, throwing rocks at him. And one of David's soldiers says, let me go over and kill him. David says, no, don't kill him because maybe he's right. Maybe this is my fault. Maybe God has forsaken me. And as he's going back to the city, this guy is there, pretty much the same spot where he was when David was fleeing, but now the tone is completely different. He comes, he grovels at David's feet. He's helping the servants bring his stuff back over the river. He's groveling, and David forgives him. David says, don't worry about it. You've been forgiven. Don't be afraid. And that's verses 19 through 23. Let's look at the interaction that they have right there in verses 19 and following. And he said to the king, let not my lord hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did wrong on the day the Lord my king left Jerusalem. Do not let the king take it to heart, for your servant knows that I have sinned. Therefore, behold, I have come this day, the first of all the house of Joseph, to come down to meet you, my lord and king. Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, said, shall not Shimei be put to death for this, because he cursed the Lord's anointed? But David said, what have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should be an adversary to me? Shall anyone be put to death in Israel this day? For do I not know that I am this day king over Israel? And the king said to Shimei, you shall not die. And the king gave him his oath. Does anybody know the word there for adversary in Hebrew? That's translated there. The Hebrew word for adversary? Satan. That's the Hebrew word used here. Where we get the word Satan from. And so literally David calls him Satan, an adversary here in this passage. Who is Abishai's brother? He had two, one's dead. Who's the other one? No? I know you know it. You're just too cold to speak. Who's his brother? Joab, right? And so when he says, you sons of Zeruiah, you cause me so much trouble. Who's he talking about? He's talking about Joab, right? His brother has just killed his son to put him in this this place of misery, right? And so he's like, man, you brothers, not you brothers, like those brothers, okay? He's like, you guys, man, you just cannot get it. You're a thorn in my flesh. And so very upsetting to him. And then we see Judah versus Israel, which is interesting because when David was first anointed king in Hebron, which tribe acknowledged him as king? Judah. The other tribes went with who? Ishabeth, right? Saul's son. When the tribes are divided, right, with Rehoboam and Jeroboam and all those good guys, where's the divide? That's exactly right. And that's what you see here. So it's interesting that even before the tribes divide with Rehoboam and Jeroboam, that you see right here that this breakage between David and the people of Israel is already there. And so you see in verses 41 and 43 that they actually argue over who loves King David the most, which is interesting because they just fought against David. And so they're trying to get that loyalty back. They're trying to show the king that, hey, we're really sorry. We love you more than Judah. And Judah's like, no, these guys don't. They didn't support you against Saul's son. They didn't support you against Absalom. We love you more. And so you had this vying for power. Does anybody know what was one of the biggest arguments after the American Revolution between the new states? Well, that was a big one, right? Jefferson versus, was it Hamilton? Yeah. Yeah. But there was a compromise. There was a problem. It had to do with what? A capital. Was it going to be in New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia? Right? The southern states said, we don't want a capital in the north because you northerners think you're all that in a bag of chips. The northern states said, well, we're definitely not let you guys have a capital in the south because we did all the work in the Revolutionary War. And so what do? They compromised, right? They took a part of Maryland, took a part of Virginia, made Washington, D.C. Now if you look on a map, the part of Virginia is not there anymore. Anybody know why? Another conflict. Global warming? No, different conflict. It's underwater. No, it's still there. Right? Civil War, right? When the Civil War took place, Virginia lost its half of Washington, D.C., at least on the map. So, interesting. But you see something similar right here. These two sides fight. And you see this rear its ugly head a few generations later with the dividing of the tribes. It's interesting to see how this rift is already there so far before what we would think about the kingdom being divided. And so you get to chapter 20. You see at the very end of 19, everybody loves David. Everybody's talking about how wonderful David is. And then you see that some people still have reservations about just how good David is as a king. The first two verses of chapter 20 tells us about a man named Sheba and about his rebellion. And look at what he says about David. Now there happened to be a worthless man whose name was Sheba, the son of Bichri, a Benjamite, and he blew the trumpet and said, we have no portion in David, and we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse, every man to his tents, O Israel. So all the men of Israel withdrew from David and followed Sheba, the son of Bichri, but the men of Judah followed their king steadfastly from Jordan all the way to Jerusalem. And so here we have Sheba, who basically says, you know what, I'm tired of this. I don't even want to mess with David anymore, so he leaves. So some of the men that had just fought with Absalom, who had just pledged their loyalty to David, leaves again and goes after Sheba. And so it's interesting. Sometimes we think of David as this king of Israel that was this unifier, this king that had such a wonderful reign. And you can see that David's popularity was not 100% approval rating all the time. That there was a very serious and strong rift, especially with the tribes in the north. Now we know from later on that the tribes in the north had a serious problem with what? Worshipping idols, right? And so they probably were already having this problem now. And so David being committed to Yahweh, and you have these men who like these foreign gods and like these foreign wives, are already starting to cause trouble even in the reign of David. And we see later on in chapter 20 that David goes back to his palace, and there are those concubines that were there. The concubines that were left behind to take care of the palace. Anybody remember having those concubines? Yeah, Absalom violated them on the roof of the palace in front of all the people to see. And so when he gets back, David gets back to the palace, he takes those concubines, and according to the law of Moses, he puts them in a part of the palace, and he never really sees them again. He provides for them food. He makes sure all their supplies are met and needed. But the text tells us that he never had relations with them physically, and they never really were seen much again. They pretty much just became widows at that point. According to the Mosaic law, Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4, when a woman's husband died, she was forbidden from going back to her first husband. And so David was probably interpreting Absalom's act as a marriage act, and that he pretty much just decided no. David's upset with one individual in particular. Does anybody can guess who that individual is? If you were David, who would you be upset with right now? More so than anybody. Joab. Joab's what? He's the commanding officer of the army, right? So if you were the king, what would you do?
I had a good replacement, I would sack him.
Yeah.
David really had to rely on Joab to help keep him in power.
He did. But
David, he worked his own animals, but
yeah.
if you remember the Bathsheba story, he's the one that carried out David's order to cause the riot there.
That's right. And so Joab, and like you were saying, if you had a good replacement, you'd sack him. That's exactly what David does. If you look at verses 4 through 13, let's go ahead and read that. Let's read about David's replacement for Joab, and let's just see how long that takes place. You think Joab's the kind of person that goes down quietly? Let's see how Joab reacts to being replaced. Then the king said to Amasa, who was also one of his other nephews, "Call the men of Judah together to me within 3 days, and be here yourself." So Amasa went to summon Judah, but he delayed beyond the set time that had been appointed by him. A little bit before this, Amasa has been made general of the army. He's taken Joab's place. And so here David says, take some men and go take care of this rebellion. Verse 6. So Amasa went to summon Judah, but he delayed beyond the set time that had been appointed to him. And David said to Abishai, "Now Sheba the son of Berki will do us more harm than Absalom. Take your Lord's servants and pursue him, lest he get himself to fortified cities and escape from us." And there he went after him at Joab's men, and the Cherethites and the Pelethites and all the mighty men. They set out from Jerusalem to pursue Sheba the son of Berkri. And when they went to the great stone that is in Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them. Now Joab was wearing a soldier's garment, and all over it was a belt and a sword in a sheath fastened on his thigh, and he went forward, it fell out. And Joab said to Amasa, "It is well with you, my brother." And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. But Amasa did not observe the sword that was in Joab's hand. So Joab struck him with it in the stomach and spilled his entrails on the ground without striking a second blow, and he died. And then Joab said to Abishai his brother, and they pursued the son of Berkri. One of Joab's young men took his stand by Amasa and said, "Whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab." And Amasa lay wallowing in his blood on the highway. And anyone who came by seeing him stopped. And when the men saw all the people stopped, he carried Amasa out of the highway into the field and threw a garment on him. And when he was taken out of the highway, all the people went on after Joab to pursue Sheba, son of Berkri. And so here we have Joab, and Joab finds Amasa, who has replaced him as the head of the army, who's gone out to find this insurrectionist named Sheba. And what does Joab do? Killed him, right? Under what guise? A kiss. Anybody else been betrayed in the Bible by a kiss? Jesus, right? Interesting. And so here we have Joab, who's dressed like a soldier. Now the text isn't clear as him being dressed as a soldier in his official garments, or was he wearing the garb of a regular soldier to get close to Amasa, who is now the leader of the army. It doesn't really say. But Joab kills him with how many blows? One blow. You think Joab was a bad man? Yeah, killing somebody with one stab, one blow. Joab was a fierce warrior. And so as Amasa is wallowing in his own blood, hanging on to life, they basically say, all right, who wants to follow Joab now? And guess what? It's unanimous. And so Joab is once again reinstated as the head of the army. Joab had some problems, don't you think? But as Brother Rich said, he was so good at his job, it made him hard to replace. And
Amasa was the general that led Absalom.
That's right. And so
Joab said, "Look, I fought and kept you in power, and now you're going to replace me with the guy who started the rebellion." Obviously they were going to bring him in, and he couldn't hardly go on without it either.
That's exactly right. If you couldn't hear Brother Rich, Amasa was actually the general of Absalom's forces. So after Joab successfully beats Absalom, David takes the commander title away from Joab and gives it to Amasa. Now how would that make you feel? Pretty bad if you're in Joab's place. So Joab is sure that he gets revenge. And so we see that in verses 4 through 13. And then verses 20 through 22, we see that Sheba is killed. Joab goes to the city where he is. They start to siege the city. They start getting ready to knock down the fortified walls and to kill everybody in the city. And then a woman pokes her head out of one of the windows in the city walls. And she says, "I want to talk to Joab." And so Joab goes and he talks to this lady in the wall of the city there. And she says, "Why do you want to kill everybody in the city? What have we done?" And he says, I'm looking for Sheba. And she says, if we give him to you, will you leave us alone? He says, yeah, I can do that. And so a little while later, a head comes thrown over the city wall. It's Sheba, right? Once the people realize that, Sheba's not going to be able to overthrow David, they turn pretty quickly. And so we see that in verses 20 through 22. And then we have a list of David's administration in verses 23 through 25. It's interesting here that if we actually look back at chapter 8, we're also given a section of David's administrators. And so the Bible didn't have chapters and verse divisions in the original text. And so there were markers to let you know that a section had started and a section had ended. And so if you look at 2 Samuel, you'll see that there is a list of administrators at the end of chapter 8. And if you see chapters 2 through 8 of 2 Samuel, talk about David's triumphs. They talk about all the battles that he was in, all the land he conquered, all the kings he subdued, and it gives you the list of his administrators. And then in chapters 9 through chapters 20, we have David's failures, all the things that he did. What are some of the things that we've talked about from chapters 9 through 20? The last 3 weeks. We've talked about Bathsheba.
The rebellion in his own house.
We've talked about the rebellion in his own house with Absalom. We've talked about killing Uriah and murder. We've talked about one of his sons raping his sister. And then him being killed at a barbecue at his brother's house. We've talked about David fleeing his own capital and city, right? Which would have been a major source of shame. We've talked about how poorly he acted after he won that battle. And so chapters 9 through 20 are not a very positive light when it comes to David. But it's important for us to realize at the end of chapter 20 that we're coming to an end of a section. Because if you go on and read chapter 21 and think that this is all in chronological order, you're going to read 21 after chapter 20, and you're going to think, wait a minute, well, something's not right here. Like, what's going on? And you're about to see why. So then we get to chapter 21. And here you can kind of see just how far Sheba ran away from David and Joab and just how far they had to go to track him down. Ran all the way to the northern part of the kingdom. It's also interesting that where he ran to is actually quite close to where Absalom also fled. And so Absalom went to Geshur, which is just a little bit north of where that map shows. And so then we get to chapter 21, and we're told about the Gibeonite famine. Let's look at verses 1 through 6. Verses 1 through 6. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And David sought the face of the Lord, and the Lord said, there is blood guilt on Saul and on his house, because he put the Gibeonites to death. And so the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them, and the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but were the remnant of the Amorites. Although the people of Israel had sworn to spare them, Saul had sought to strike them down in his zeal for the people of Israel and for Judah. And David said to the Gibeonites, what shall I do for you? How shall I make atonement that you may bless the heritage of the Lord? And the Gibeonites said to him, it is not a matter of silver or gold between us and Saul or his house. Neither is it for us to put away any man into death in Israel. And he said, well, what shall I say? What shall I do for you? And they said to the king, the man who consumed us and planned to destroy us so that we should have no place in the territory of Israel, let 7 of his sons be given to us so that we may hang them before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord. And the king said, I will give them. But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Saul's son, Jonathan, because of the oath of the Lord that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. And so here these Gibeonites had been slaughtered by who? Saul. Okay? When do you think this takes place? Yeah, the early part of David's reign. And so here we have chapters 9 through 20, right? That puts us to the very end of David's reign, late in his life. And then we just get thrown in reverse all the way back to the very beginning of David's reign here in chapter 21. And that's what I was trying to say. If you just read the Bible, from chapter 1 through chapter 23, and you're just reading, you get chapter 21, it'll throw you for a loop because you're thinking, wait a minute, what's going on right now? Because you'll see a little bit later why you can get confused. But there's some problems there. We're not told exactly what happened to the Gibeonites. We're told in Joshua chapter 9, verse 3 through 27, why the Gibeonites tricked the Israelites. If you remember back in the land of conquest, there was a group of people who put on sojourner's clothes, and they tricked Joshua and the Israelites to making a plea or a deal with them that they would not kill them, even though God told them to kill all the people in the land. The term here used for hang probably means that they were going to be executed publicly, and their bodies were going to be hung on display, probably tied to a city wall, or their bodies put on stakes. And so, who do they ask for? Yeah, right? What had David promised Saul himself? Yeah, David promised Saul that he would not kill any of his descendants. Did David kill any of Saul's descendants? No. Yeah, but he did give 7 over to the Gibeonites, knowing full well what they were going to do. And so they take 7 of these guys, and if you read on this chapter, who's one of the 7? Why does it get confusing? Verse 7 says that he spares Mephibosheth. And then when you read the list of 7 guys, the descendants of Saul who were killed, who's in the list? Mephibosheth. There's a contradiction in the Bible. It's not inspired. There's problems scattered all throughout. That's what people would say, right? How would you describe that? You're having a study with somebody and they say the Bible's not the inspired word of God. It has errors all the time. I mean, just turn to 2 Samuel chapter 21. I mean, it says Mephibosheth is saved, and then it says he's killed. How? Yeah. Maybe there's more than one in Israel, right? I mean, raise your hand in the audience if your name is John. All right, bad example, okay? The only congregation in the world with one John. All right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Family names, right? I mean, so it's very common, especially that day and age, for people to bear the same names, because there was pretty much 2 major factors in picking of names at this time and age. Your father's household and the God you worshipped. And so those 2 things pretty much made up your name. Well, if you're from the same father's household, right, and you worship the same God in that family, there's probably a good case you're going to have more than one John, or more than one Bill, or if you're like in the South, Bobby, or something like that. You're going to find more than those guys. And so that's what happens here in these verses. And so the Gibeonites get revenge in verses 7 through 14. And then we see the Philistine battles that David was in verses 15 through 22. Sorry for that typo. And so let's look at some of the Philistine battles that David was in. David was a tremendous soldier. Much of that was from Joab and Abishai and other people he had in his army. And so let's read here about the battles that he fought, verses 15 and following. There was war again between the Philistines and Israel, and David went down together with his servants, and they fought against the Philistines. And David grew weary. And Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of the giants, whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze, and who was armed with a new sword, thought to kill David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to his aid and attacked the Philistine and killed him. Then David's men swore to him, "You shall no longer go out with us in battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel." And after this there were again war with the Philistines at Gob. Then Sibbecai and the Hushathite struck down Saph, who was one of the descendants of the giants. And there again was war with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan, the son of Jeri-Orjim, the Bethlehemite, struck down Goliath at Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And there was again war of Gath, and there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 fingers on each foot, 24 in number. And he also was a descendant from the giants. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. These 4 were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. Does anybody remember the giants? not the movie from the 90s. What giants are we talking about here in this passage?
Philistine.
Jonathan's son is dead. You look at verse 12.
But they're talking about the descendants from these giants. These guys are just massive, great warriors, but they were descendants of the giants. Not necessarily the Nephilim, not necessarily Genesis 6. Yeah. If you remember, when Moses sent out the spies, right? You had the 10 spies plus Caleb and Joshua. They came back and they were scared, right? Because they talked about who? The giants, right? About the giants in the land, that we were just like grasshoppers to them. And so that was the land of Canaan. Where is this at? Land of Canaan, right? These are the descendants from the people that Joshua and the spies were talking about. These were these mighty warriors. The Hebrew word there is Rapha, which is a term for, sometimes it's translated in some of your Bibles as the Rephaim, which were mighty warriors who originally inhabited the Canaanite coastal plain. They're mentioned in Genesis 15, 19 through 21, Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 11, Deuteronomy 3:11, and Deuteronomy 3, verse 13. They terrified the spies that Joshua sent out, and they're talked about in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33. Were these literal giants? It depends on how you define giants. They're massive. Yeah. Has anybody ever met an NFL football player in real life? Okay. You walk up one of those guys and you'll call them giants. I got to stand on the sidelines one time for a Titans game. I mean, it was back when Javon Curse played for the Titans and Albert Hainsworth was on the field. I mean, the wide receivers who on TV look scrawny are massive. I mean, they're so big. I mean, can you imagine being on a battlefield with somebody that big? I mean, that would be a giant. I mean, that would be somebody who was just super, especially if you're fighting somebody with a sword or a spear. You've got to be in hand-to-hand physical contact. And so these are the ones that they're talking about. They're giants, if you will.
Are these giants the same ones that David killed the giant?
Yeah, Goliath. I mean, what nation was Goliath from?
Philistine.
He was a Philistine from Gath, right? And so who are these individuals? Yeah, they're Philistines, right? And so same people. And so you have a group of individuals who are larger, who are stronger, and here they're mentioned as giants. And so here we see that even though David has struggles in his life, God has still blessed him. Why is that? Why has God continued to bless David even in the midst of his struggles?
David was a man after his own heart.
Yeah, he was a man after God's own heart. Was it because he was perfect? No. Why? He was repentant. He messed up a bunch. But every time he messed up, he found his way back home. The takeaway story for us is that none of you are perfect. I'm not perfect. And thank goodness for that, because just like David, as long as we are repentant and brush ourselves off, proverbially, and get back and walk in the light, season of light, God will continue to bless us too. And so David is an individual that we can look at. Hopefully after this study, we'll have one more study that kind of gives a capsule on the end of David's life and about his death. But David is one of those characters that so many people love because he's not perfect. And God loved him. He blessed him. He made a covenant with him. And just like David, we'll never be perfect. But we can be faithful. And we can try. And when we mess up, because we will, we can dust ourselves back up, tell God we're sorry, and try to do better. And that's the takeaway we can have from David, is trying to live that faithful life, not a perfect life. Any questions or comments from class tonight? Thank you for your attendance and your comments, and we'll close the prayer. Dear God, thank you for all the blessings you've given us. We're so thankful for the word that you've given us for our instruction. Dear Heavenly Father, please help us to look at your servants like David, knowing that they were not perfect, but they were faithful. And dear Heavenly Father, we know that we'll never be perfect in our own lives, but help us to be faithful. Help us to be penitent. Help us to pick ourselves back up whenever we fail you, whenever we do wrong, and recommit ourselves to you and your word and your will. Please watch over each individual person here tonight. Help us to be the light this community needs, and help us bring others closer to you. We're so thankful for the gift of your Son. It's in His name we pray. Amen.